One woman is a brilliant doctor, my husband announced, raising his crystal glass. The other is our family maid. The elegant dining room erupted in loud laughter as he pointed first to his mistress, then to me, his wife. I did not cry. Instead, I poured him a glass of wine that would cost him his entire secret life. What I said next made all 12 people at that Thanksgiving table drop their forks in absolute shock. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and I am the woman who orchestrated the most ruthless holiday dinner in suburban history. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of a toxic partner while secretly plotting your ultimate exit. It was Thanksgiving evening at our sprawling $2 million home in Connecticut. I had spent 2 days preparing a flawless feast. The mahogany dining table was set perfectly. The rich aroma of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce filled the air. My husband Richard, who is 36 and a senior investment director, stood proudly at the head of the table. To his right sat Dr. Stephanie. She is 31, a plastic surgeon, and supposedly just a close corporate partner of his firm. To his left sat his mother Brenda, his sister Caroline, and her husband Derek. Derek is a brilliant African-American tax attorney, and honestly, the only person in this room who ever treated me with genuine respect. The rest of the 12 guests were Richard's elite colleagues from the financial district. I was standing by the kitchen island quietly untying my stained apron. I was exhausted, but hyper-aware of every dynamic in the room. Brenda had already spent the first hour making passive-aggressive comments about my cooking and loudly asking Stephanie about her luxurious lifestyle. Richard clinked his silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone turned their attention to the golden boy of the family. "I want to propose a toast." Richard began, his voice booming with that signature arrogance his family absolutely adored. "This year has been phenomenal. I want to give special recognition to the people who make this high-level success possible." He gestured widely towards Stephanie, who was wearing a fitted emerald silk dress that cost more than my first car. To Dr. Stephanie, a shining example of modern female excellence, a brilliant surgeon, an indispensable partner to our investment strategies, and a woman who truly understands the rigorous demands of success. Stephanie smiled demurely, brushing a lock of perfect blonde hair behind her ear. A chorus of approvals and raised glasses echoed around the table. Brenda beamed at Stephanie with pure adoration, practically wishing aloud that she was her daughter-in-law. Then Richard deliberately turned his cold gaze to me. I was still holding a heavy porcelain gravy boat, my hair pulled back in a messy bun. The cruel smirk on his face was unmistakable. And of course, he continued, his tone shifting to dripping sarcasm and mock gratitude. "We must thank Natalie." As I look at these two women, it is clear. One woman is a brilliant doctor, but the other is our family maid. Let us toast to the best maid a guy could ask for. Her greatest achievement this year was finally figuring out how to run the new dishwasher without flooding the kitchen floor. The room erupted. 12 people, including my own mother-in-law and sister-in-law, burst into roaring laughter. Stephanie covered her mouth, giggling softly while leaning closer to my husband's shoulder. They thought I was utterly weak. They thought I was just the unemployed housewife who had spent the last 3 years doing absolutely nothing after losing my corporate job. They fully expected me to burst into tears and run upstairs in shame. But I did not move a single muscle. I waited patiently for the laughter to die down. The room slowly grew quiet as the guests noticed my absolute chilling stillness. I placed the gravy boat down on the counter. I picked up a bottle of red wine that I had kept hidden behind the centerpiece. It was a vintage Chateau Margaux. I walked slowly and deliberately to the head of the table. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. I stopped right next to Richard. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second as I leaned in and calmly poured the dark red liquid into his empty glass. "You are absolutely right, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously steady and loud enough for every single person to hear. This maid wants to make sure you have the absolute best tonight. I hope you truly enjoy this Chateau Margaux. It is a spectacular vintage. $5,000 a bottle to be exact. Richard let out a forced, nervous chuckle looking around at his wealthy friends. Well, you certainly have expensive taste when you are spending my hard-earned money, sweetheart. I smiled warmly, looking directly into his panicked eyes. Oh, I did not use your personal checking account, darling. I put it on the hidden corporate credit card. You know, the untraceable black card you told the firm you lost last month. The same exact card you have been secretly using to pay for Stephanie's luxury hotel suites. The silence that followed was completely deafening. The arrogant smirk vanished from Richard's face, instantly replaced by a pale, sickening dread. Dui day là phần nói dung kit ban. Đoan hai bằng tiếng Anh được tinh chỉnh hoàn toàn, không chứa dấu câu đặc biệt hay tiêu đề tối ưu cho giọng đọc AI, và tiếp nối chính xác, mạch truyền. Richard stared at the bottle of wine as if it were a venomous snake. His hand gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. For years he had meticulously crafted his public image. To his wealthy colleagues sitting in our dining room, he was the ultimate family man and a brilliant financial strategist. To his mother and sister, he was the flawless golden boy who carried the immense burden of providing for a wife who had supposedly lost her ambition. He loved playing the martyr. He loved complaining about how hard he worked to maintain our luxurious lifestyle while I stayed home doing absolutely nothing. But right now, that perfect facade was cracking wide open. An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the 12 guests. One of the senior partners at his firm set his wineglass down very slowly, exchanging a concerned look with his wife. The corporate credit card I mentioned was not just a regular company expense account. It was a secondary black card issued under a shell vendor name to bypass the firm audits. Richard had confidently reported it lost 30 days ago to clear his tracks before the end of the fiscal year. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the unemployed housewife he left at home every day lacked the intelligence to understand a basic ledger. He had racked up over $80,000 in unauthorized personal expenses in just 2 short months. That is a simple accounting error, Richard finally stammered. His voice was noticeably higher than usual. His charismatic tone was entirely gone. Natalie, you do not know what you are talking about. You have been out of the corporate world for 3 years. You probably misunderstood a basic bank statement. Please go back to the kitchen and let the adults finish their meal. I did not retreat. I leaned closer, resting my hands calmly on the back of his expensive leather dining chair. A simple accounting error, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the heavy air. That is fascinating, Richard. Because an accounting error does not usually book a 5-star luxury suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan for 3 consecutive weekends. An accounting error does not order room service champagne and oysters at 2 in the morning. And an accounting error certainly does not purchase the $60,000 diamond tennis bracelet currently sparkling on Dr. Stephanie Wright's wrist. Instantly, every single pair of eyes in the room snapped to Stephanie. She gasped and instinctively grabbed her right wrist, trying to hide the brilliant diamonds under the sleeve of her emerald dress. But it was too late. The light from the dining room chandelier had already caught the massive stones. Her face flushed a deep crimson, and she shifted awkwardly in her chair, suddenly looking very small. The brilliant surgeon and indispensable corporate partner was now visibly sweating, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Derek, my brother-in-law, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. As a seasoned tax attorney, he knew exactly what using an unreported corporate card meant. A faint smile played on his lips as he watched the scene unfold. He was the only one at the table who was not looking at me with shock. He was looking at me with newfound respect. He knew Richard was legally and financially cornered. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His chest was heaving beneath his custom-tailored suit. He looked frantically at his colleagues, hoping someone would jump in to defend his honor. But the senior executives were practically holding their breath, calculating the legal implications of what I had just revealed. They knew a corporate fraud scandal could ruin their entire firm. I stood tall, my posture perfect. I had spent 3 years swallowing his condescending remarks. 3 years of letting him introduce me as his burden, his charity case, and now his maid. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the humiliation he had tried to drown me in. I wanted him to realize that the woman he thought he had buried was actually the one holding the shovel. Are you going to explain the accounting error to your partners, Richard? I asked softly with a polite smile. Or should I bring out the itemized receipts I printed from the offshore server you thought was secure? Before Richard could even formulate a lie, the heavy dining table shook violently. The silverware rattled against the fine china. Brenda, his mother, slammed her palms flat onto the table and pushed herself up. Her face was contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to tremble as she glared at me from across the room, preparing to unleash her fury. "How dare you disrespect my son in his own home?" Brenda shrieked. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room, completely shattering whatever polite silence remained. "You ungrateful little brat. Richard works 80 hours a week to provide you with a life of luxury while you sit around doing absolutely nothing." She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. Her diamond rings flashed aggressively under the chandelier light. "You lost your accounting job 3 years ago, Natalie. 3 whole years. You have not contributed a single dime to this marriage since the day you were let go. My son took pity on you. He could have left you when you became dead weight, but he stayed because he has a good heart. He bought you this magnificent $2 million house. He pays for your clothes, your food, and the very air you breathe in this exclusive neighborhood." The corporate guests looked extremely uncomfortable, but they remained glued to their heavy mahogany seats. They were witnessing a brutal family execution, and Brenda was proudly swinging the axe. For years, Brenda had made it her personal mission to remind me of my place. She loved coming over unannounced, inspecting the baseboards for dust, and reminding me that I was merely a guest in a kingdom her son had built. Caroline, my sister-in-law, nodded in vigorous agreement with her mother. "Yes," Caroline chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You should be down on your knees thanking him every single day instead of making up vicious lies about corporate credit cards. You are just threatened by Stephanie because she actually has a real career and contributes to society." Stephanie sat a little taller at that remark, subtly adjusting her designer emerald dress. The power dynamic in the room had temporarily shifted back in their favor. They honestly believed that weaponizing my supposed financial dependence would instantly force me into submission. That was always their ultimate trump card. The threat of taking away my shelter and exposing my financial inferiority to the world. Seeing his mother and sister aggressively rushing to his defense gave Richard a sudden burst of false courage. He seemed to recover a fraction of his shattered confidence. He straightened his expensive silk tie and let out a long, suffering sigh, playing the exhausted victim perfectly. "Mom, please calm down and leave her alone," he said, using that fake, gentle tone he reserved exclusively for public performances. "Natalie has been struggling mentally lately. Being unemployed and isolated for so long has clearly taken a severe toll on her perception of reality. Let us not make a scene. I will make sure we get her the professional psychiatric help she needs first thing tomorrow morning." The audacity was genuinely breathtaking. He was actively trying to gaslight me in front of 12 important witnesses. He wanted them to believe I was a hysterical, delusional housewife who was cracking under the pressure of her own inadequacy. I looked at Brenda, who was still standing with her chest heaving with righteous indignation. I looked at Caroline, who was smirking at me like a victorious high school bully. And then I looked at Richard, who was attempting to wear a flawless mask of deep husbandly concern. I did not scream. I did not throw my hands up in the air or burst into tears of frustration like they fully expected me to. Instead, I simply smiled. It was not a forced or polite smile. It was a smile of absolute icy control that made the hairs on the back of Richard's neck stand up. I reached out across the table and gently took hold of the expensive fine china dining plate sitting directly in front of Brenda. It was part of a very specific custom set she had aggressively demanded we use for this holiday dinner because it matched her own wealthy aesthetic. I slowly lifted the heavy plate from the table, spilling a few breadcrumbs onto the white linen tablecloth, and flipped it entirely upside down. Brenda gasped loudly, completely offended that I would handle her favorite fine china so carelessly in front of company. "What on earth are you doing, you clumsy fool?" she snapped, reaching out to snatch it back from my hands. But I did not drop it, and I did not give it back. I simply held the bottom of the plate up directly in front of her angry face. Right there, baked permanently into the pristine white porcelain glaze, was a small, discreet gold logo of an exclusive luxury property management group. "You see, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "That little gold emblem on the bottom of the plate belongs to Oak Hollow Property Management. They manage high-end residential leases across the entire state." "Leases, Brenda. Not deeds, not mortgages. Leases." Brenda blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between the plate and my face. Her brain was clearly struggling to process the information. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice losing its aggressive edge and replacing it with pure confusion. "Richard bought this house 3 years ago. He showed me the real estate paperwork himself." I gently placed the plate back onto the table. "He showed you a residential lease agreement that he disguised in a thick legal folder," I corrected her. "Richard did not buy this $2 million home. He could never afford the massive down payment on his legitimate salary alone. Instead, he signed a very strict lease with a private real estate holding company called Horizon Holdings, LLC. He has been paying $12,000 a month in rent for the past 36 months. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic sound from the head of the table. He grabbed his linen napkin, desperately wiping beads of cold sweat from his forehead. His perfectly tailored designer suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking posture. Caroline scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "So what if he rents?" she sneered, trying desperately to salvage her brother and his shattered image. "Plenty of wealthy people rent luxury properties. It makes perfect financial sense for his portfolio. It does not change the fact that he is the one paying for the roof over your head. You are still just living off his hard work, Natalie." I turned my gaze to Caroline, offering her a smile dripping with absolute pity. "Oh, Caroline, you are so incredibly close to understanding the punchline," I said softly. "It is absolutely true that Richard has been paying $12,000 a month to Horizon Holdings, LLC. Every single month, like clockwork, the funds leave his account. But what my dear husband never bothered to check was the incorporation documents for that specific LLC. I reached into the deep pocket of my dress and pulled out a crisp, folded document. It was a certified copy of the state business registry. I dropped it right in the center of the table next to the cranberry sauce. Because if he had done a basic background check, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silent dining room, he would have discovered that I am the sole proprietor and president of Horizon Holdings, LLC. I bought this property as a distressed investment 3 years ago, using my corporate severance package and some very aggressive stock trades. I hired Oak Hollow to manage it anonymously so my husband would never know. The collective gasp from the 12 guests was incredibly satisfying. Derek, my brother-in-law, let out a loud, booming laugh that he quickly tried to disguise as a cough. He covered his mouth, but his eyes were dancing with absolute delight. As a brilliant tax attorney, he completely understood the magnificent magnitude of the trap Richard had blindly walked right into. "You mean to tell me," Brenda whispered, her face turning an alarming shade of pale, "that my son has been paying rent to his own wife for 3 years?" "Exactly, Brenda." I nodded pleasantly. "While you were busy inspecting my baseboards and calling me a useless freeloader, your golden boy was dutifully depositing $12,000 a month directly into my private investment portfolio. He did not buy me a house. He bought my mortgage for me. I am not his charity case. I am his landlord. And technically, since he is currently in violation of the moral turpitude clause in our lease agreement, I have the absolute legal right to evict him with 30 days' notice." Richard looked completely physically ill. The arrogant man who had just toasted to his own supremacy was now staring at his empty wine glass like a defeated child. The corporate executives at the table were actively leaning away from him as if his utter stupidity might be highly contagious. The power dynamic in the room had completely shattered. Brenda sank back into her heavy chair, holding a trembling hand to her chest. The financial dominance they thought they held over my head for years was nothing but an elaborate illusion that I had carefully orchestrated and profited from. But just as the heavy reality of the situation settled over the dining room, Dr. Stephanie decided she had heard enough. She could not stand watching her powerful, wealthy lover be humiliated by a woman she considered far beneath her. She placed her manicured hands flat on the table and sat up rigidly straight, her emerald dress catching the chandelier light. "A clever piece of paper does not change who you actually are, Natalie," Stephanie said, her voice sharp and incredibly condescending. "So you played a real estate trick on your husband. Congratulations. But let us be completely honest here. You do not have a real career. You do not save lives or negotiate high-level corporate mergers like we do. Richard needs a woman who can challenge him intellectually, someone who actually belongs in these high society circles. You might own the physical house, but you will always just be a basic housewife playing dress-up for the holidays." I did not flinch. Instead, I slowly walked back to the kitchen counter. I knew Stephanie would eventually try to assert her intellectual and professional dominance. I was counting on it. Stephanie took a slow, deliberate sip from her crystal water glass, clearly savoring what she believed was her ultimate victory. "You see, Natalie?" She continued, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "This room is filled with individuals who actually move markets and change lives. Richard is a financial visionary. He is building a legacy. He simply cannot be chained to a woman whose greatest daily intellectual challenge is picking out matching curtain fabrics for a house she secretly hoarded." She reached out and placed her manicured hand over Richard's hand. He looked incredibly tense, but he did not pull away. He needed her to defend him. He needed her to legitimize his betrayal. "He needs a partner," Stephanie declared, looking around the table to gather silent nods of approval from the corporate guests. "He needs an absolute equal. Someone who can stand beside him at high society charity galas and actually understand the complex economic policies being discussed. Take my new penthouse in Manhattan, for example. I closed on it just last month. It takes a very specific level of elite financial acumen to navigate real estate at that tier. I did not need to hide behind a shell company or trick my partner to secure my assets. I earned my status through years of grueling medical school and building a top-tier surgical practice. That is the kind of prestige Richard deserves to be associated with." Caroline aggressively nodded her head. "Exactly," Caroline chimed in, pointing a spoon in my direction. "Stephanie is a self-made woman. You are just bitter because you know you can never compete with her on any level. You are trying to ruin this dinner because you are deeply jealous of her success." Brenda let out a dramatic sigh and shook her head. "It is just pathetic, really," Brenda added, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are embarrassing yourself, Natalie. You played your little landlord trick and we are all very shocked. But you should take whatever pride you have left. Go upstairs, quietly pack your bags, and leave these successful people to enjoy their evening." I stood leaning casually against the marble kitchen counter. I picked up a clean linen towel and slowly dried my hands. The sheer absolute arrogance radiating from the far end of the table was almost cinematic. Stephanie truly believed she was the brilliant mastermind of this little affair. She honestly thought she was a fiercely independent woman building a modern empire alongside a wealthy king. She was so incredibly confident in her own superiority that she had completely blinded herself to the reality of the man sitting right next to her. A self-made woman, I repeated the phrase softly, letting it echo across the quiet dining room. I tossed the linen towel onto the counter. "That is a very powerful term, Stephanie. It implies that every single brick of your beautiful success was laid entirely by your own two hands." It implies a flawless, independent work ethic, free from anyone else checking account. I walked back toward the center of the dining table, but I did not return to my empty chair. Instead, I stopped right next to the massive silver tray, holding the roasted Thanksgiving turkey. The bird was surrounded by beautiful rustic garnishes of rosemary and cranberries. The guests watched my every move with cautious fascination. "You are very proud of that new Manhattan penthouse," I said, my eyes locking directly onto Stephanie. "And you absolutely should be. It is a stunning piece of modern architecture, overlooking Central Park with a private elevator and wrap-around floor-to-ceiling windows. I believe the final purchase price was somewhere around $4.5 million. Truly an incredible milestone for a dedicated medical professional." Stephanie lifted her chin proudly, her emerald dress shimmering. "It is," she replied with a smug little smile. "And I am glad you at least have the basic mental capacity to appreciate it, even if you will never be able to afford anything like it on your own." "Oh, I appreciate it much more than you could ever possibly know, Stephanie," I replied smoothly. My voice was calm but carried a razor-sharp edge that made Derek sit up straighter in his chair. Without breaking eye contact with the brilliant doctor, I slid my right hand underneath the intricate, heavy silver turkey tray. My fingers instantly grasped the edge of a thin manila folder I had deliberately hidden there hours before any of the guests had even arrived. I slowly pulled it out from under the hot silver platter and let it drop onto the pristine white tablecloth with a soft, heavy thud. "What I find truly fascinating about your brilliant self-made real estate transaction, Stephanie," I said, tapping my fingernail against the cover of the folder, "is the massive $400,000 cash down payment you made on October 12th. Because according to this stack of highly confidential international wire transfer records, that money did not come from your top-tier surgical practice." Stephanie froze. The confident smile that had been permanently plastered across her face just moments ago completely evaporated. She darted a panicked look at Richard, who was now gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles looked like they might shatter. His face was devoid of all color matching the pristine white tablecloth. I opened the thin manila folder and spread the crisp bank statements across the table, right next to the cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. "Let us trace the journey of this brilliant self-made investment," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. On October 1st, $400,000 was transferred from a corporate reserve account at Richard Firm. It was categorized as a high-risk overseas venture capital investment. But it did not go to an overseas tech startup, did it, Richard? Richard opened his mouth, but he was completely paralyzed by fear. The senior partners at the table were now leaning in, staring intently at the documents I had just laid out. Their initial shock was rapidly turning into corporate panic. The money, I continued tracing my finger along the highlighted ledger lines, was routed through a dummy corporation in Panama before finally landing in a private offshore trust fund located in the Cayman Islands. A very secretive account named the Apex Global Trust. It is a brilliant way to hide assets from tax auditors and suspicious wives. The only problem is, I know exactly how to unmask anonymous offshore entities. I picked up the final sheet of paper and held it up for the entire room to see. It was a certified notarized document, and according to the Cayman Islands Registry, the sole authorized beneficiary and managing director of the Apex Global Trust is my loving husband, Richard. Brenda let out a small, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Caroline stared blindly at the paperwork, her brain entirely unable to comprehend the massive federal crime her perfect brother had just committed. Derek, my brother-in-law, sat perfectly still. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses, observing the financial suicide happening before him. As a tax attorney, he knew the sheer magnitude of the evidence I had just presented. He knew Richard was not just facing a firing squad at work, he was facing severe federal indictment. I turned my attention back to the brilliant surgeon who was now gripping her water glass as if it were a life preserver. "So you see, Stephanie," I said, shaking my head in mock disappointment, You did not buy that $4.5 million penthouse. You did not use the grueling earnings from your top-tier medical practice. My husband bought it for you using embezzled funds he systematically drained from his own investment firm. You are not a fierce, independent woman building an empire. You are a glorified mistress living in a stolen apartment funded by massive corporate fraud. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. One of the senior executives stood up immediately, pulling his wife up by her arm. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard. You stole from the firm, he yelled, his face turning purple with rage. You funneled client money into a Cayman trust to buy an apartment for your mistress. Are you completely out of your mind, Richard? The SEC will tear us apart. Stephanie pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She tried to stammer out a defense, claiming she had absolutely no idea where the money came from, but nobody was listening to her anymore. The prestigious reputation she had flaunted just 10 minutes ago was completely annihilated. She was now legally tied to a massive money laundering operation. Richard was hyperventilating. His eyes darted wildly around the room, watching his entire perfectly curated life burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. His career was over. His wealthy friends were already planning his corporate execution, and the wife he had publicly humiliated and treated like a maid was standing triumphantly over the ashes. "Give me those papers," Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying growl. It was a sound I had never heard him make before. A sound of a desperate, trapped animal. He stood up, his chair crashing backward to the floor. I did not back away. "These are copies," Richard the Fry stated calmly. "The originals are already secured." But rational thought had completely abandoned him. The charming financial visionary was gone, entirely replaced by a man facing decades in federal prison. "Shut your mouth!" he screamed, his face contorted in absolute violent rage. Before anyone could even process his sudden movement, Richard launched himself across the mahogany table. He knocked over the heavy crystal wine glasses, sending dark red liquid spilling violently across the white linen like blood. He shoved the massive silver turkey platter out of the way, sending the roasted bird crashing onto the floor. His hands extended aggressively forward, aiming directly for my throat, intending to choke the life out of me and tear the confidential file from my hands. Richard's hands were inches from my neck. The heavy silver platter clattered to the floor, sending cranberry sauce and roasted turkey sliding across the expensive Persian rug. But before his fingers could even brush my skin, a dark blur moved across my peripheral vision. Derek, my brother-in-law, moved with a speed and ferocity that completely shocked everyone in the room. He had been sitting quietly, analyzing the situation, but the moment Richard crossed the line into physical violence, Derek intervened. His fist connected solidly with the side of Richard's jaw. The sickening crack echoed loudly over the gasps of the corporate executives. Richard was instantly thrown off balance. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the spilled wine, and he crashed hard into the mahogany buffet table behind me. Expensive crystal bowls shattered around him, raining glass onto his customized suit. Brenda let out a piercing theatrical scream. "My baby!" she shrieked, trying to rush forward, but her own high heels caught on the rug, causing her to stumble back into Caroline's arms. Caroline was hyperventilating, staring at her husband in absolute horror. "Derek, what did you do?" Caroline cried out, her voice trembling. "You just assaulted my brother." Derek did not even look at his wife. He stood firmly between me and Richard, his broad shoulders tense, his chest heaving slightly. As a brilliant African-American tax attorney who had built his entire career navigating high-stakes financial law, Derek possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor in the face of absolute chaos. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at Richard, who was currently spitting blood onto the pristine white floorboards. "Stay exactly where you are, Richard." Derek commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone that demanded immediate obedience. "Do not move a single muscle. If you try to touch her again, I will not just knock you down, I will lay you out completely." Richard groaned, pressing a trembling hand to his swelling jaw. He looked up at Derek with eyes full of venom and betrayal. You are supposed to be family, Derek, he spat out defensively. You are supposed to be on my side. Derek let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He slowly reached down and picked up one of the manila folders that had scattered across the floor during the brief scuffle. He did not need to read the entire document. A single glance at the offshore routing numbers and the encrypted beneficiary codes was more than enough for his legally trained mind. Family does not make me an accessory to federal wire fraud, Richard Derrick said, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. Family does not make me complicit in corporate embezzlement or international money laundering. I am a sworn officer of the court and a specialized tax attorney. I know exactly what I am looking at right now. Derek dropped the paper directly onto Richard's chest. You created a shell trust in the Cayman Islands to hide stolen venture capital funds from your own firm. And then you brought your senior partners to a holiday dinner thinking you could play everyone for fools. You are facing the IRS, the SEC, and a federal judge who will not care about your charming smile. If you had actually managed to put your hands on your wife tonight while facing these specific financial felonies, they would have buried you under the prison. I just saved you from adding aggravated assault to your inevitable federal indictment. The senior partners from the investment firm were already pulling out their phones, quietly dialing their own corporate crisis management lawyers. They were actively stepping away, treating Richard like a radioactive hazard. Stephanie, the brilliant doctor, was slowly inching her way toward the hallway, trying to figure out how to escape the house without drawing any more attention to her own massive legal liability. Derek finally turned his back on the pathetic man bleeding on the floor. He slowly walked over to where I was standing. I had not moved a single inch during the entire physical altercation. My pulse was completely steady. My face was completely calm. I simply watched the powerful men in the room realize that the game was entirely over. Derek looked at the remaining documents neatly organized on the dining table. He traced the edge of the financial charts, the perfectly highlighted ledger discrepancies, and the certified government registry stamps. His legal mind was rapidly processing the sheer impossibility of what I had just accomplished. He knew that pulling these specific encrypted records required high-level security clearances and forensic financial skills that a regular unemployed citizen simply did not possess. It was not just a lucky internet search. It was a surgical professional takedown orchestrated by someone who deeply understood the architecture of white-collar crime. Derek looked up from the table. He locked eyes with me. The anger in his expression had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, calculating curiosity and a profound sense of awe. You did not just stumble upon this information by accident. Derek said, his voice low enough for only the two of us to hear, but heavy with absolute certainty. You bypassed 3 layers of corporate encryption and tracked untraceable offshore assets with absolute perfection. He took a slow step closer, his dark eyes studying my face as if seeing me for the very first time in 3 years. What do you really do for a living, Natalie? I looked at Derek and allowed a genuine smile to finally reach my eyes. 3 years ago, when my corporate accounting firm let me go, it was not because of poor performance. I explained, my voice echoing clearly across the ruined dining room. It was because I had discovered massive regulatory violations at the highest levels of the company. I handed my findings over to the federal government. The Securities and Exchange Commission was so incredibly impressed with my ability to completely dismantle a corrupt financial structure that they recruited me immediately. I did not spend the last 36 months sitting around watching daytime television or struggling with depression. I am a senior forensic auditor working exclusively for the SEC. My entire job is to hunt down white-collar criminals, investigate offshore money laundering operations, and expose arrogant men who think they are smarter than the federal government. I work completely remotely, highly encrypted, and entirely under the radar. Richard thought I was just doing online shopping in my home office all day long. In reality, I was auditing complex international portfolios and seizing illicit assets from corrupt executives. Richard, who was still slumped against the shattered buffet table, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. His bleeding jaw was already turning a deep dark purple from where Derek had struck him. "You investigated your own husband," he choked out, spitting a mouthful of blood onto his ruined white luxury shirt. "You spied on me in my own house. I did not have to spy on you, Richard," I replied coldly, stepping closer to him so he could hear every single word. "You were incredibly sloppy." About 6 months ago, the federal government flagged a highly suspicious pattern of venture capital funds disappearing from your specific investment firm. They assigned the initial investigation to my specialized forensic unit. When I opened the main federal dossier and saw my own husband's name listed as the primary suspect, I could have easily recused myself due to a massive conflict of interest. That is standard government protocol. But after finding luxury hotel receipts for Dr. Stephanie carelessly hidden inside your golf bag, I decided to take the federal assignment personally. I spent 6 agonizing months meticulously building an airtight criminal case against you while cooking your dinners and washing your expensive laundry. I mapped out every single hidden transaction, every fake shell company, and every offshore wire transfer you ever authorized. You thought you were a financial genius, but your digital footprint was an absolute disaster. You used the exact same password for your encrypted Cayman accounts that you use for our home security system. You left your personal laptop unlocked on the kitchen island while you showered. I did not even need a federal subpoena to access most of your arrogant mistakes. You basically handed me your entire federal indictment on a silver platter. The corporate executives sitting around the table were completely paralyzed by fear. They were suddenly breathing the same air as an undercover federal auditor who had just exposed a massive financial crime right under their noses. They knew that everything they had said or done tonight might be entered into a permanent federal log. One of the senior vice presidents slowly pushed his chair back and put his empty hands flat on the table as if trying to show he was completely unarmed and entirely uninvolved in the fraud. Stephanie, the brilliant surgeon, was backed firmly against the dining room wall, hyperventilating and clutching her diamond tennis bracelet as if it could magically transport her out of the house. Derek simply nodded slowly, a look of profound professional respect washing over his face. He finally understood that I was not a victim in this marriage. I was the executioner. But the absolute stunned silence of the room was suddenly broken by a high-pitched hysterical scream. Caroline stepped out from behind her husband, her face twisted in pure, irrational fury. She could not handle the rapid destruction of her perfect family narrative. She stomped her expensive designer heel into the floor, completely ignoring the severe magnitude of the federal crimes I had just outlined. "You are a complete psychotic liar," Caroline screamed, her voice breaking into a shrill, terrifying pitch. "You are a manipulative, evil woman. You set my brother up. You orchestrated this entire horrible scheme just to steal his money and ruin our perfect family name because you are a jealous, vindictive housewife. This is highly illegal. You cannot just hack into his private bank accounts without permission. I am going to call my lawyers right now. I am going to sue you for defamation, invasion of privacy, and every other civil charge I can find until you do not have a single penny left to your name. Sue me, Caroline." I repeated the threat, letting out a soft but genuine laugh that only seemed to infuriate her more. "You want to hire a team of elite civil litigators to drag a federal auditor into a courtroom. That sounds like a wonderful plan. You are going to sue the federal government for investigating a federal crime. But I have one very practical question for you, Caroline. How exactly are you going to pay for these expensive lawyers?" Caroline puffed out her chest, ready to brag to the entire room. "I have my own money," she spat back aggressively. "My husband is a highly successful attorney, and my brother takes care of his family." I turned my gaze to Derek. "Derek," I asked politely, "do you currently pay for your wife and her daily shopping sprees? Did you authorize the purchase of that brand new luxury electric vehicle sitting in my driveway right now?" Or the $30,000 designer handbag she is currently clutching against her chest like a protective shield. Derek tightened his jaw. His dark eyes shifted toward his wife, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "We share a joint account," Derek stated firmly, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "And I certainly did not authorize a new car or a designer bag. Caroline told me those were gifts from Richard. She said it was a bonus from his firm to thank her for helping him organize his corporate charity events." "Gifts from Richard the First," echoed, nodding slowly, as if I was deeply impressed. "A bonus for charity work. How incredibly generous of him. Richard, the ultimate family man, providing for his little sister so she can play the role of a wealthy socialite without ever having to clock in for a single day of actual hard work. You drive a luxury car, you wear custom designer clothes, and you send your children to a private academy that costs $40,000 a year. You live a lifestyle that far exceeds what a single-income household can comfortably afford, even with a husband as successful as Derek." Caroline's face turned a sickly shade of red. "It is none of your business how my brother chooses to spoil me," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly as she realized Derek was glaring at her with intense suspicion. "He loves his family. He shares his success with us because he is not a selfish, bitter woman like you. He is a provider. He is a parasite, Caroline." I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave and easily cutting through her delusional defense. "A provider uses his own hard-earned money to support the people he loves. A parasite attaches himself to a host and drains it dry to buy the loyalty and admiration of shallow people like you. Richard did not buy you that car or those bags because he loves you. He bought them because his fragile ego requires constant worship, and you were perfectly willing to be bought. You claim to be an independent high society mother, but your entire existence is funded by a man who uses you as a prop to boost his own pathetic self-esteem." Caroline opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but Derek raised his hand, silencing her instantly. "Where did the money come from, Natalie?" Derek asked, his voice dangerously quiet. If he did not use his firm accounts to buy her those things, what money did he use? I review their taxes every single year. I would have noticed large cash transfers from his personal accounts. "You would have, Derek?" I agreed, nodding respectfully to the brilliant tax attorney. "Because you are a meticulous lawyer." Richard knew he could not send Caroline large sums of cash from his own legitimate bank accounts without you asking questions or the government flagging the transfers. And he had already maxed out his corporate embezzlement scheme to fund Stephanie and her expensive Manhattan penthouse. So he had to find another source of capital, an entirely different well to poison. I reached down to the mahogany table and placed my hand firmly over the open manila folder. The corporate executives in the room leaned in collectively, holding their breath. Even Brenda, who had been quietly weeping into her napkin, looked up with sudden, dreadful anticipation. I slowly flipped past the international wire transfers and the Cayman Island registry documents. I turned to the second page. This document was not printed on standard bank paper. It was a dense legal contract filled with authorized signatures and heavily stamped by a state notary. Richard squeezed his eyes shut and let his head fall back against the shattered buffet table. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner to drop the heavy blade. He knew exactly what page I was holding. "You see, Caroline," I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "Richard is not just a corporate thief. He is a master at finding vulnerable targets close to home. You want to know how your brother funded your luxury lifestyle. I am going to show you exactly whose pocket he picked to buy your loyalty." I looked directly at my mother-in-law. Brenda had stopped crying. She was staring at the heavy legal document on the table with a look of profound confusion. For her entire life she had worshipped the ground Richard walked on. She had defended his every flaw, praised his every basic achievement, and proudly told all her wealthy friends that her son was a financial genius. She trusted him implicitly with everything she had. "Brenda," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, not out of pity, but to ensure every single word landed with absolute clarity. 2 years ago, shortly after your husband passed away, Richard convinced you to transfer your entire retirement portfolio and the life insurance payout into a private wealth management account. He told you that standard bank interest rates were practically robbing you. He promised he would personally manage your funds to guarantee a luxurious, stress-free retirement. Brenda nodded slowly, her heavily powdered face turning a shade paler. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the dining room chandelier. He is a senior director. He knows the markets. He sends me quarterly statements showing a 20% return on my investments. I slid the heavy legal document across the white linen tablecloth until it rested right next to her empty wine glass. Those quarterly statements were completely fabricated, Brenda. Richard generated them on his personal laptop using a basic spreadsheet template. What you are looking at right now is the actual certified ledger from the clearinghouse. It shows every single transaction made from your retirement account over the past 24 months. Brenda's hands were shaking so violently she could barely pick up the piece of paper. The corporate guests in the room were completely silent, watching the absolute destruction of a family play out in real time. Derek stepped closer to his mother-in-law, his eyes scanning the certified numbers over her trembling shoulder. As a tax attorney, he did not need more than 10 seconds to read the bottom line. He closed his eyes and let out a heavy breath, shaking his head in sheer disgust. "Read the final balance, Brenda," I instructed quietly. Brenda adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes scanning down to the bold black numbers at the bottom of the page. She gasped sharply as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. "Zero!" She choked out the word, tearing through her throat. "It says the balance is zero. Where is my $800,000? Where is my survival money?" I turned my attention back to Caroline, who was now staring at her mother in absolute horror. "Your brother did not get a corporate bonus," Caroline, I explained, pointing to the highlighted withdrawal columns. "On March 14th, he liquidated $40,000 from your mother's retirement fund. On March 15th, you drove home in a brand new luxury electric vehicle. On August 2nd, he withdrew $30,000. 2 days later, you were posting pictures online, holding a limited edition designer handbag." Caroline dropped her expensive bag onto the floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. She backed away, shaking her head frantically. "No," she stammered, looking from me to Richard. "No, Richard told me he had a massive quarter at the firm. He said he wanted to treat me. I did not know it was Mom's money. I swear I did not know. But Richard did not just buy your loyalty, Caroline." I continued, refusing to let the tension drop. "He used the rest of Brenda Life savings to cover the massive margin calls on his own failing personal investments. He drained every single penny of his own mother's security just to maintain the illusion that he was a wealthy, successful king. He left you completely destitute, Brenda. If you check your bank account tomorrow morning, you will find out that you do not even have enough money left to pay your property taxes this year." The reality of the situation crashed down on the dining room like a physical weight. The golden boy, the perfect son, the brilliant provider was nothing but a cowardly thief who had stolen his widowed mother's future to fund his mistress and his ego. Brenda let out a sound that I will never forget. It was a visceral, agonizing wail of pure heartbreak. She clutched the fabric of her expensive dress right over her chest, her face contorting in unbearable pain. She collapsed heavily back into her dining chair, gasping for air as the ultimate betrayal shattered her entirely. "You stole from me," she screamed, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her ruined makeup. "You stole your own father's money. How could you do this to me, Richard? How could you ruin me?" Richard was completely backed into a corner. His carefully constructed empire had been reduced to ashes in less than 20 minutes. The federal crimes, the offshore accounts, the stolen house, and now the ultimate familial betrayal. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a single ounce of remorse, the arrogant narcissist did exactly what cornered rats do. He lashed out. He pointed a shaking, bloody finger directly at me, his eyes wide with frantic, desperate madness. "Do not listen to her, Mom!" Richard yelled, his voice echoing hysterically around the room. "She manipulated those documents. She is a government auditor, she knows how to fake these ledgers. And even if the money is gone, she forced me to do it. She demanded this expensive lifestyle. She sat in this $2 million house and demanded luxury while refusing to work. She drove me to this. She is the one trying to destroy this family. Richard wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his trembling hand. He took a deep breath, attempting to summon the charismatic leader his colleagues had known for years. He turned away from his weeping mother and looked directly at the senior partners sitting rigidly around the ruined dining table. "You all know me," he pleaded, his voice dripping with manufactured desperation. "You know the kind of man I am. I have generated millions for our firm. Do you honestly believe I would be stupid enough to leave a trail of wire transfers and shell companies lying around my own house?" He pointed an accusing finger at me, shaking his head with a perfectly practiced look of tragic pity. Natalie suffered a severe nervous breakdown 3 years ago when she lost her corporate job. That is why she retreated into this house. She has been completely paranoid, consumed by a toxic, delusional jealousy. She could not handle the fact that my career was skyrocketing while hers had completely stalled out. She is sick, and she needs serious psychiatric intervention. He gestured toward the terrified surgeon, who was still pressing herself flat against the dining room wall. "Stephanie and I have a strictly professional relationship." Richard lied seamlessly, his voice gaining a sickening surge of false confidence. "We consulted on a medical tech investment portfolio. That is all. But my wife became morbidly obsessed with her. She used her high-level government clearance to fabricate every single piece of paper sitting on this table. She engineered these fake ledgers to frame me, to destroy my reputation, and to extort me because she knew I was finally preparing to file for divorce. It was a breathtaking performance. For a brief, agonizing moment, the heavy atmosphere in the room actually shifted. Gaslighting was Richard's absolute superpower. He had spent his entire life twisting reality to suit his narrative, and he was doing it right now with his back completely against the wall. A few of the corporate executives exchanged uncertain glances. The idea of a disgruntled, unhinged government employee forging documents to ruin a cheating husband was a massive scandal, but it was significantly better than facing a federal investigation into their own firm. They desperately wanted to believe his lie. It was their only potential lifeline. Caroline aggressively seized the opportunity to escape reality. "I knew it," Caroline gasped, stepping forward and pointing at me triumphantly. "I told you she was psychotic. She is trying to send my brother to federal prison over a pathetic, jealous delusion. Mom, do not listen to her. Richard would never steal your retirement. She hacked into the accounts and moved the numbers around to break your heart. She is a monster." Even Brenda, who was still clutching her chest, looked up with a desperate glimmer of hope in her tear-filled eyes. She wanted nothing more than to believe her precious golden boy was the victim of a malicious conspiracy. She reached out her trembling hand toward Richard, seeking the comfort of his familiar lies. She wanted to be blind again. I did not interrupt his brilliant monologue. I simply stood there watching the absolute limits of his depravity. He was willing to publicly declare his own wife clinically insane rather than take accountability for bankrupting his widowed mother. I slowly shook my head, letting out a soft, genuine laugh that instantly shattered his fragile illusion. "You truly are a fascinating psychological study, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through his desperate noise. "You are asking a room full of seasoned financial experts to believe that a single SEC auditor managed to single-handedly forge Cayman Island registries, state-notarized bank ledgers, and federal wire transfer confirmations right here in my kitchen without triggering a massive government alarm. You are asking them to bet their entire corporate careers on the absolute absurd lie that you are an innocent victim of a jealous housewife." Richard swallowed hard, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth to double down on his manufactured reality, trying to maintain his grip on his mother and his sister, but I did not give him the chance to speak another word. "You claim that you and Dr. Stephanie are strictly professional business partners. I continued walking slowly toward the smart home control panel mounted on the dining room wall. You claim that I am a paranoid, delusional woman trying to destroy your life over an imaginary affair. If that is the absolute truth, Richard, then you will not mind if I share a little home movie with our guests tonight. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen twice, immediately syncing my device to the expensive surround sound audio system that Richard had proudly installed throughout the entire house. He had spent thousands of dollars on these speakers, never realizing I had connected them to the hidden security cameras in his private home office. Cameras equipped with high-definition microphones that he never bothered to check. I pressed the play button on my screen. A sharp electronic beep echoed through the hidden ceiling speakers, followed by the crystal-clear sound of ice clinking against a glass. Then came a voice that everyone in the room recognized instantly. It was Richard. The final transfers will clear by Thursday afternoon. His recorded voice echoed confidently through the dining room. The Cayman accounts are fully funded and untraceable. We just have to get through this stupid turkey dinner. Then came Stephanie's voice, sultry and entirely relaxed. And what about your mother, Richard? What happens when the bank realizes her retirement fund is completely empty? The recorded Richard let out a cold, dismissive laugh. Who cares? The old woman can file for bankruptcy. Or Caroline can finally take her in and pay for her care. I have spent my entire life carrying this family on my back. It is time they fend for themselves. By the time they wake up tomorrow morning, we will already be landing in Cabo San Lucas. I booked the private charter for midnight. The recording continued detailing their exact route to the private airfield. They discussed how they planned to slip out the back door while the family was asleep in a holiday food coma. I tapped my screen again and the audio abruptly cut off, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I looked at Brenda. She was no longer crying. The sheer magnitude of the cruelty she had just heard completely broke her spirit. Her precious son, the boy she had worshipped, had planned to steal her last dime and abandon her to state care while he drank margaritas on a Mexican beach. Caroline stood completely paralyzed by the audio. The brother who she claimed was her ultimate provider, the one she defended so viciously just minutes ago, was fully prepared to dump the financial burden of their aging mother squarely onto her shoulders. Her luxurious lifestyle was entirely funded by the very theft that would now ruin her own household. Derek looked at his wife with a cold, calculating stare, silently processing the sheer magnitude of the liability she had brought into his life. Richard stood frozen. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. His gaslighting defense was entirely obliterated. There was no way to claim I had faked an audio recording that perfectly captured their specific travel itineraries and their cruel dismissal of his own mother. He looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but he found absolutely nothing. The corporate executives were looking at him with pure disgust. Derek stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. But the most dramatic reaction did not come from Richard's family. It came from Dr. Stephanie. The brilliant self-made surgeon suddenly realized the absolute gravity of the situation. She was not just a mistress caught in an affair. She was an accessory to federal embezzlement, elder abuse, and now a documented accomplice in a premeditated flight risk to evade federal prosecution. The glamorous illusion she had built for herself was collapsing. She knew the federal government would seize her medical license, her penthouse, and every dollar she had ever touched. The instinct for self-preservation violently kicked in. Stephanie pushed herself away from the dining room wall. Her eyes were wide with sheer panic. She looked at Richard, who was staring blindly at the floor, and then she looked at me. I had nothing to do with this. Stephanie shrieked, her voice completely cracking under the immense pressure. He lied to me. He told me the money was legitimate from his personal bonuses. I did not know he stole it from his mother or the firm. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes widening in absolute shock, as the woman he had destroyed his life for instantly turned against him. Stephanie, what are you doing? He pleaded, stepping toward her, but she aggressively slapped his hand away. Do not touch me, you disgusting thief! She screamed, grabbing her expensive designer coat from the back of the nearest chair. You manipulated me! You used my name on those property deeds without explaining the risks. I am a victim here just like everyone else. Stephanie frantically shoved her feet into her high heels and clutched her purse tightly against her chest. She was perfectly willing to throw Richard directly into the federal fire if it meant saving her own skin. I am leaving right now, she declared breathlessly, looking wildly at the corporate executives as if hoping they would validate her sudden innocence. I am going straight to the authorities to tell them everything he forced me to do. I am not going down for your pathetic crimes, Richard. She turned on her heel and made a desperate dash toward the grand entryway, determined to escape the mansion before the consequences could catch her. Richard stared at the massive mahogany doors that had just slammed shut behind Derek. The heavy sound echoed like a death knell through the ruined dining room. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes no longer held the arrogant superiority of a senior investment director. They were filled with the sheer absolute panic of a trapped animal. The corporate executives in the room were already whispering frantically to each other. Several of them had stood up and were quietly moving toward the hallway, grabbing their expensive coats and pulling their wives along. Nobody wanted to be in the same room when the federal authorities arrived. They were treating Richard like a highly contagious disease. Brenda was still frozen in her high-backed chair. She had no energy left to scream or cry or defend her golden boy. The absolute shock of knowing her entire life savings had been completely drained by her precious son had broken her spirit entirely. Caroline was still sobbing into the expensive rug, calling out for the husband who had just abandoned her. Their perfect family facade. The illusion of wealth and superiority they had used to torture me for years was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I walked slowly toward the dining table, where the highly classified federal documents were still scattered across the white linen. I carefully gathered them, one by one, stacking them into a neat, crisp pile. Richard watched my every move, his chest heaving violently beneath his ruined custom suit. He knew those papers were his absolute death sentence. His brilliant master plan to escape to Mexico at midnight with his mistress was completely destroyed. Stephanie had abandoned him the exact second she smelled federal danger. Now he was entirely alone to face the massive legal consequences of his own insatiable greed. Suddenly, a desperate thought crossed his mind. He glanced sharply toward the back hallway that led directly to the attached garage. His luxury sports car was parked right outside. The keys were still sitting in his pocket. If he could just get out of the house before the police arrived, he might still have a tiny sliver of a chance to run. He had hidden offshore cash reserves that he assumed I might not have found yet. He thought he could still outsmart the system. Without saying a single word, Richard spun around and sprinted toward the dark hallway. He took massive, desperate strides, completely ignoring the shattered fine china and spilled wine crunching beneath his expensive shoes. Caroline looked up from the floor and screamed his name, begging him not to leave her alone, but he did not even look back. He was a coward, running from the fire he started. He reached out and grabbed the solid brass handle of the heavy back door, twisting it with every ounce of strength he had left. But the door did not move a single inch. Richard froze. He yanked the handle again, pulling it violently toward his chest, but it remained as solid as a steel wall. He frantically reached for the smart home security panel mounted on the wall right next to the door. He punched his master access code into the glowing digital screen. The screen flashed bright red and displayed a massive access denied warning. "What is happening?" he muttered, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. He slammed his fist against the heavy wooden door, screaming in pure frustration. "Open the door right now." He threw his entire body weight against the wood, but it was completely useless. I walked slowly down the hallway, stopping just a few feet behind him. I crossed my arms over my chest, watching him struggle with absolute calm. "You forgot something, Richard?" I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet space. "You do not own this house. You are just a tenant." And as the legal owner of this property, I have absolute administrative control over the entire smart security system. I held up my smartphone, showing him the active security application. The moment you stood up to give that humiliating toast calling me your maid, I initiated a complete lockdown. Every single door, window, and perimeter gate is electronically dead-bolted. The access codes have been permanently changed. The glass break sensors are armed and ready. You cannot leave, Richard. The $2 million house you loved to show off to your friends is now your own personal holding cell. He spun around to face me, his eyes burning with absolute pure hatred. You are a monster, he hissed, lunging toward me with his bloody hands outstretched. I will kill you before they walk through that door. But before he could close the distance between us, a piercing sound shattered the heavy silence of the neighborhood. The loud wail of police sirens echoed from the end of the street, rapidly approaching our driveway. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights swept across the massive living room windows, casting a ghostly, terrifying glow over Richard's pale face. He stopped dead in his tracks, his arms dropping uselessly to his sides. The game was officially over. The sound of Stephanie frantically scrambling toward the front door echoed through the silent house. She was desperate to escape the federal nightmare she had helped create. But the true turning point of the evening did not belong to the fleeing mistress. It belonged to the man sitting quietly at the end of the table. Derek. My brother-in-law slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. As a brilliant African-American tax attorney, Derek had built a spotless reputation. He had spent his entire career navigating complex financial laws and protecting his clients from the exact type of catastrophic ruin Richard had just invited into this dining room. Derek adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not look angry. He looked entirely professional, which was somehow far more terrifying. He looked directly at Richard, who was still leaning heavily against the shattered buffet table, bleeding from his jaw. Richard, I want to make my legal position absolutely clear. Derek began, his voice resonating with the cold authority of a courtroom judge. As of this exact moment, I am formally and permanently severing all personal and professional ties with you. I will not represent you. I will not advise you. And I will certainly not allow my pristine legal career to be dragged into a federal investigation because you decided to run a massive money laundering operation through a plastic surgery clinic and steal your own mother's retirement money to fund your pathetic ego. Richard opened his mouth to beg, but Derek raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. Do not speak to me, Derek commanded. Anything you say to me right now is not protected by attorney-client privilege, and if I am subpoenaed by the federal government, I will testify against you without a single moment of hesitation. You are a financial terrorist and you have completely destroyed your own life. The corporate partners still in the room nodded in silent agreement, completely terrified of Derek and his absolute legal clarity. Several of them quietly noted his contact information, planning to hire him to protect their own assets from the upcoming federal fallout. Derek then turned his attention away from the ruined golden boy and looked down at his wife. Caroline was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her perfect family illusion. Her expensive mascara was running down her face, and her designer clothes looked pathetic against the backdrop of massive corporate fraud. Caroline, get up, Derek said, his tone shifting from legal authority to the stern expectation of a husband trying to save his family. We are leaving right now. Go to the guest room, get your coat, and walk out the front door with me. We are going home to our children, and we are never speaking to your brother again. Caroline blinked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and panic. She looked at Richard, who was staring blankly at the floor. Then she looked at her mother, Brenda, who was weeping silently into her hands, clutching her chest as if her heart had literally broken in two. For her entire life, Caroline had been conditioned to believe that Richard was the ultimate authority, and Brenda was the fragile victim who needed constant protection. The toxic dynamic of her childhood was deeply ingrained in her psyche. I cannot just leave them, Caroline sobbed, shaking her head stubbornly. Look at my mother. She has absolutely nothing left. She is completely broken, and Richard needs you. You are a brilliant lawyer, Derek. You know how to talk to the authorities. You can fix this. You can find a legal loophole and negotiate a deal to keep him out of federal prison. You have to save my family. Derek stared at his wife as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Caroline, did you not hear a single word I just said? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Your brother committed federal wire fraud. He embezzled millions from his own firm. He stole your mother's entire survival fund to buy a penthouse for his mistress. There is no legal loophole for absolute arrogant stupidity. He is going to federal prison, and if you stay here, you are going straight down with him. I am offering you exactly one chance to walk out of this toxic environment and save our own family. But Caroline stood up and actually took a step backward away from her husband. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, adopting the same defensive posture her mother always used. Family sticks together, Derek, she declared, her voice trembling but defiant. Richard has always provided for us. He bought me my luxury car. He bought me my clothes. I am not going to abandon my own flesh and blood just because things got difficult. If you really loved me, you would stay and help us fight this malicious woman. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, blaming me for the entire disaster, rather than holding her brother accountable for his own crimes. Derek let out a slow, heavy breath. He looked at his wife's defiant stance, recognizing the absolute depth of her delusion. She was choosing the toxic comfort of her abusive family over the safety of her own marriage and children. He slowly nodded, his expression turning completely hollow. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, realizing that he had to execute a contingency plan he had prepared weeks ago, but hoped he would never have to use. Derek pulled a crisp, folded document from his tailored suit jacket instead of his cell phone. The entire room held its collective breath. Caroline wiped her ruined mascara and looked up at him with a desperate glimmer of hope. She truly believed that her brilliant husband was about to leverage his elite legal connections to magically fix her brother's massive federal crimes. She thought he was pulling out a contact list to call a powerful judge or a defense attorney to make this entire nightmare disappear. But Derek did not look like a man trying to save his family. He looked like a man delivering a death sentence. Did you really think I was just a blind ATM? Caroline, Derek asked, his voice echoing with a cold, terrifying precision. Did you honestly believe that I, a senior tax attorney, would never review the financial statements coming into my own home? Caroline froze. Her eyes darted frantically between the document in his hand and his unforgiving expression. What are you talking about, Derek? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I do not understand what you are holding. Derek let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Last month I noticed a significant discrepancy in our joint tax filings. He explained, speaking slowly so every single person in the room could hear her shame. I saw a massive influx of cash deposited directly into a private account registered under your maiden name. When I demanded a full ledger from the bank, they provided the transaction history. You received direct wire transfers from the exact same shell company Richard used to launder his stolen firm money. These were not small holiday gifts, Caroline. These were huge, structured deposits designed to avoid federal flagging. The silence in the dining room was absolutely suffocating. Even the corporate executives stopped moving. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with fresh horror as she watched her daughter's perfect marriage disintegrate right in front of her. Her golden boy was a thief and her daughter was a willing accomplice. That was just the allowance Richard gave me, Caroline cried out frantically, trying to justify her absolute greed. He told me he landed a huge corporate bonus. I swear I did not know it was stolen money, Derek. I did not know he took it from Mom. I just wanted nice things so I could fit in with his wealthy friends. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense, Caroline, especially when it is willful. Derek replied, his patience completely exhausted. You signed the receipt authorizations. You put your name on those offshore routing numbers. And the absolute worst part is that when I specifically asked you how you afforded that luxury car and those designer bags, you looked me dead in the eye and lied. You told me you earned that money from your part-time consulting gig. You betrayed my trust and compromised our household just to protect your brother's fragile ego. Derek tossed the folded document onto the mahogany table right next to the federal whistleblower files I had laid out earlier. This is a finalized petition for divorce, Derek announced, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. I had my colleagues draft it last week when my suspicions were officially confirmed. I was planning to wait until after the Thanksgiving holiday to serve you. But after watching you aggressively defend the man who just bankrupted your own mother, I do not have a single reason to delay this process any longer. I refuse to be collateral damage in your toxic family dynamics. Caroline let out a blood-curdling scream that pierced the heavy air. She threw herself forward desperately, grabbing at Derek's legs. "No, Derek, please, you cannot do this," she wailed, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive clothes. "You cannot leave me here with nothing. We have 2 children. You cannot destroy our family over my brother's mistakes. You destroyed this family the moment you chose his lies over our marriage," Caroline, Derek said, coldly prying her hands off his suit pants. "My lawyers will file these papers first thing tomorrow morning. You can stay here with your bankrupt mother and your criminal brother. I am filing for full emergency custody. I absolutely refuse to let my children grow up in an environment poisoned by this level of deceit and manipulation." Without offering her another glance, Derek turned and walked straight toward the grand entryway. The remaining guests quickly stepped out of his way, looking at him with a mixture of fear and profound respect. He pulled open the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing November night. The sound of the door clicking shut severed the final lifeline this family had left. While everyone was completely captivated by Caroline screaming on the floor, Richard slowly backed away from the ruined table. He realized that Derek taking his legal expertise out the door was the final nail in the coffin. The police would be arriving at any moment. Richard frantically scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the dark hallway that led to the garage. He decided to make his final, desperate move. Richard stood completely paralyzed, staring at the massive front doors that had just clicked shut. The sound echoed through the ruined dining room like a final, devastating gavel strike. Derek, taking his brilliant legal mind and walking out into the freezing Thanksgiving night, was the ultimate death blow to Richard's carefully constructed empire. The remaining corporate executives did not waste another second. They were already moving rapidly toward the foyer, grabbing their expensive wool coats and rushing their wives out the door. None of them wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. They looked at Richard as if he were a walking contagion, entirely eager to distance themselves from his massive financial crimes. Brenda remained frozen in her high-backed dining chair. Her heavily powdered face was stained with dark tears, and her hands gripped the table edge so tightly her knuckles were completely white. The profound shock of realizing her beloved golden boy had systematically drained her entire life savings, had shattered her perception of reality. Caroline was still curled on the expensive Persian rug, weeping uncontrollably, as the reality of her impending divorce and public humiliation crushed her. The perfect affluent family they had weaponized against me for years was now nothing more than a pathetic pile of ashes. While the remaining guests scrambled to escape, Richard slowly backed away from the dining table. His eyes darted frantically around the room. He knew the documents I had exposed were an absolute death sentence for his career and his freedom. His brilliant mistress had abandoned him the moment she smelled federal danger. His own brother-in-law had legally severed all ties. He was entirely alone. But the sheer arrogance that had driven his massive fraud also fueled a desperate delusional instinct to survive. He looked toward the dark hallway that led directly to the attached garage. His luxury sports car was parked right inside, and the keys were heavy in his tailored suit pocket. He thought that if he could just slip out the back door and get behind the wheel before the authorities surrounded the property, he might actually have a chance to disappear. He had secret offshore cash reserves that I had not yet explicitly mentioned. He truly believed he could still outsmart everyone. Without a single word of apology to his weeping mother or his devastated sister, Richard abruptly turned and sprinted toward the dark hallway. He took long, frantic strides, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the shattered remains of Brenda's favorite fine china plate. Caroline looked up and screamed his name, begging him not to leave her alone in the wreckage, but he did not even turn his head. He was a coward running from his own disaster. He reached the heavy solid wood door that connected the house to the garage. He extended his trembling hand, grasping the thick brass handle and twisting it violently toward his chest. He expected the door to swing open and grant him his freedom, but the door did not move a single inch. Richard gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He yanked the brass handle again, pulling it with his entire body weight, but it remained completely locked. He frantically turned toward the smart home security panel mounted on the wall just a few inches away. He rapidly punched his personalized master access code into the digital touchscreen, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. The screen flashed a brilliant warning red and emitted a sharp error tone displaying a massive access denied message. "What is happening?" he muttered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He slammed his fist against the heavy wood, screaming in absolute panic. "Open this door. Open the door right now." I walked slowly down the hallway, stopping just a few feet behind his panicked form. I crossed my arms and watched him struggle, maintaining a posture of absolute calm. "You are forgetting a very important legal detail, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet space. "You do not actually own this property. You are just a tenant on a lease agreement. And as the absolute legal owner of this massive estate, I maintain ultimate administrative control over the entire smart security network." I held up my smartphone screen, illuminating the active command center application. "The very moment you stood up to give that humiliating toast and called me a maid, I initiated a complete lockdown protocol. Every single door, window, and perimeter gate has been electronically sealed. The access codes have been permanently rewritten. The glass break sensors are fully armed. You cannot leave, Richard. The $2 million mansion you love to brag about is now your personal holding cell." He spun around to face me, his eyes burning with pure, violent desperation. "You are a monster," he hissed, taking a threatening step forward. "I will kill you before they walk through that door." But before he could lunge at me, a piercing sound shattered the silence. The deafening wail of police sirens echoed down the street. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights swept across the dining room windows, casting a terrifying glow over his pale face. The federal authorities had finally arrived. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark hallway, casting long, terrifying shadows against the expensive wallpaper. Richard stumbled backward, his previous murderous rage instantly evaporating into pure physical terror. He looked at the massive front windows, watching the silhouettes of heavily armed federal agents quickly surrounding the perimeter of the $2 million property. The deafening sound of police sirens was abruptly cut off, leaving only the heavy, aggressive pounding on the solid mahogany front door. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." A loud, authoritative voice boomed through the thick wood. "Open the door immediately." The remaining corporate executives in the dining room erupted into absolute panic. These were men and women who spent their entire lives hiding behind expensive lawyers and gated communities. They considered themselves entirely untouchable. Now they were watching a federal raid unfold right in the middle of their high society Thanksgiving dinner. One of the senior vice presidents dropped his crystal wine glass, letting it shatter on the hardwood floor as he frantically dialed his legal counsel. His wife let out a high-pitched scream, clutching her pearl necklace and backing away from the table. They all knew that just being present in this room could trigger a massive audit of their own extensive portfolios. At the front entryway, Dr. Stephanie was completely trapped. She had been desperately trying to unlock the deadbolt just seconds before the police arrived. Now she was backed into the corner of the grand foyer, her designer coat clutched tightly against her chest. She was trembling violently as the heavy pounding on the door shook the entire wall. She knew the authorities waiting on the other side of that door were here for her just as much as they were here for Richard. The brilliant medical career she had bragged about was officially over. Richard looked at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and pleading. He was waiting for a miracle that simply did not exist. I did not give him a single ounce of sympathy. I raised my smartphone and calmly tapped the master unlock icon on my security application. A loud mechanical click echoed through the grand foyer as the heavy deadbolts retracted simultaneously. The massive mahogany doors swung open violently. Cold November air rushed into the warm, luxurious house, followed immediately by a dozen federal agents. They wore dark tactical gear and heavy windbreakers with the letters FBI and Financial Crimes Unit emblazoned in bright yellow across their backs. "Nobody move a single muscle," a senior tactical officer shouted, his voice echoing through the massive living room. "Keep your hands where we can see them and step entirely away from the dining table. Do not touch any documents." The sheer visual impact of federal agents storming the pristine holiday dinner was absolutely breathtaking. Brenda let out a terrified shriek and buried her face in her hands, completely unable to watch her precious son be taken down. Her desperate denial was finally shattered. Caroline scrambled backward on the Persian rug, pressing her back against the wall, sobbing hysterically, as heavily armed officers secured the room. The wealthy corporate guests immediately raised their hands in the air, completely terrified of making a wrong move. Stephanie dropped to her knees in the foyer, weeping and raising her hands in immediate surrender. Richard was completely frozen in the hallway. He watched helplessly as agents poured into his supposed sanctuary. Two officers immediately moved toward the dining room table, securing the classified financial ledgers, the Cayman Island registries, and the offshore wire transfers that I had neatly stacked just minutes before. They pulled out evidence bags, knowing exactly what they were looking for, because I had already mapped it all out for them. Then a tall, distinguished man walked through the front door. He was not wearing tactical gear. He wore a sharp, dark suit and a long trench coat projecting an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. He was the special agent in charge of the regional white-collar crimes division. His sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the chaotic scene, quickly taking in the weeping mother, the terrified sister, the cornered mistress, and the panicking executives. Richard immediately recognized the shift in authority. Desperation fueled a sudden burst of adrenaline. He tried to summon his old corporate charm, straightening his ruined suit jacket and stepping toward the lead agent. "Listen to me, officer," Richard pleaded, his voice shaking, but attempting to sound professional. "There has been a massive misunderstanding here. I am a senior investment director. This is my home. You are frightening my family. I demand to speak to my attorney before you do anything else. This entire situation is a complete setup orchestrated by my mentally unstable wife." The lead federal agent did not even blink. He did not slow his pace, and he did not verbally respond to Richard. He simply walked right past the crumbling golden boy, treating him as if he were completely invisible. Richard reached out a hand trying to intercept the man, but a tactical officer immediately stepped forward, placing a firm, heavy hand on Richard's chest and shoving him roughly backward against the wall. "Stay exactly where you are," the officer commanded. The special agent in charge walked straight down the hallway, stopping directly in front of me. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Even Caroline stopped sobbing just long enough to watch. The powerful federal agent offered me a warm, respectful smile. He then did something that made Richard physically drop to his knees in pure disbelief. The agent gave me a deep, formal bow of his head. "Good evening, Natalie," the agent said, his voice carrying a tone of immense professional admiration. "Your offshore asset tracking was absolutely flawless. Thank you for handing us the biggest financial bust of the decade. We will take it from here." The entire dining room seemed to stop spinning the moment the special agent in charge bowed his head to me. The terrified corporate executives, the weeping mother, and the sobbing sister all stared in absolute bewilderment. They simply could not comprehend why the most powerful law enforcement officer in the room was treating the supposed family maid like a highly decorated commanding officer. Richard pushed himself off the wall, his chest heaving violently as he stared at the federal agent. "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "She is just a disgruntled housewife. She does not know anything about offshore assets. You have the wrong person. She is crazy." The special agent slowly turned his head to look at Richard. His expression was a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "You really have no idea who you are married to, do you?" the agent asked, shaking his head. "Natalie is not just a housewife, Richard. She is a registered and highly vetted whistleblower for the Securities and Exchange Commission. She has been working as an independent forensic contractor for our division for the past 3 years. We placed her on your specific corporate file 6 months ago when your firm first triggered our internal embezzlement algorithms." The agent reached into his tailored trench coat and pulled out a thick sealed envelope, handing it directly to me. He then looked back at the crowd of terrified executives who were practically holding their breath in the dining room. For those of you who are unfamiliar with federal financial law, the agent announced, his voice projecting clearly across the massive living room, the Securities and Exchange Commission operates a highly lucrative whistleblower program. When a private citizen provides original, timely, and credible information that leads to a successful federal enforcement action, they are legally entitled to a massive financial reward. Specifically, they receive between 10 and 30% of the total monetary sanctions collected by the United States government. Caroline stopped crying for a brief second, her tear-stained face contorting in pure confusion as she tried to do the math in her empty head. Brenda looked up from her trembling hands, her mind struggling to process the monumental shift in power that was happening right in front of her eyes. Richard embezzled roughly $40 million from his firm and various private clients over the past 2 years. The agent continued brutally laying out the exact numbers for everyone to hear. Thanks to Natalie providing us with the exact decrypted routing numbers, the Cayman Island trust documents, and the property deeds for the Manhattan penthouse, we have already frozen every single stolen asset. We will be recovering the full $40 million by tomorrow morning. The agent turned back to me, offering another warm, respectful smile. "The Federal Commission Board has already reviewed your case file, Natalie. Given the flawless nature of your evidence, the sheer magnitude of the recovery, and the danger you put yourself in to secure these documents, they have pre-approved a 25% whistleblower bounty." The collective gasp that echoed through the room was absolutely cinematic. The math was incredibly simple but entirely devastating for the family that had spent years treating me like absolute garbage. 25% of $40 million was a clean $10 million. I stood perfectly still, holding the sealed federal envelope in my hands. The corporate guests who had laughed at me just an hour ago were now staring at me with a terrifying mixture of shock and profound envy. The unemployed charity case the woman Richard had just publicly humiliated and told to go wash dishes was about to receive a $10 million payout directly from the federal government. And it was all completely legal, absolutely tax compliant, and entirely funded by Richard and his own massive arrogance. Richard Legg simply gave out. The charismatic golden boy, the financial visionary who demanded absolute worship from his family, completely collapsed under the crushing weight of his new reality. He realized that his entire criminal enterprise, his elaborate lies, his stolen millions, and his cruel betrayals had all been secretly, meticulously harvested by the woman he slept next to every single night. He had spent 3 years trying to break me, to make me feel small and entirely dependent on his charity. Instead, he had unknowingly built my absolute financial independence. He hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, pathetic thud. The expensive tailored suit he wore was ruined, stained with spilled wine and floor dust. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning whatever shred of dignity he had left in his body. The federal agents watched in silent disgust as he dragged himself across the floor toward me like a beaten animal. He reached out with trembling, bloody hands and wrapped his fingers tightly around my ankles. He buried his face against my shoes, sobbing hysterically, like a broken child begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. "Natalie, please," Richard sobbed, his tears soaking into the leather of my expensive shoes. You have to stop them. Tell the agents you made a massive mistake. Tell them the money was an authorized corporate bonus and you just misunderstood the complex financial paperwork. We can still fix this. We can hire the best defense lawyers in the country and make all of this disappear. Please tell them to let me go. I looked down at the top of his head. His perfectly styled hair was now completely disheveled and covered in dust from the floor. Two heavily armed tactical agents immediately stepped forward, ready to physically pull him off my legs. But the special agent in charge held up a hand, signaling them to wait. He wanted to see exactly how I would handle the pathetic man groveling at my feet. The corporate executives who were still trapped in the dining room watched in absolute stunned silence. They were witnessing the total psychological destruction of a man they had once respected. Richard realized I was not immediately responding to his desperate pleas, so he escalated his emotional manipulation. He looked up at me, his face stained with blood and tears, desperately trying to summon the charming husband I had fallen in love with 5 years ago. Do not do this to us, Natalie, he pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully. You have to remember our wedding day. Remember the vows we took in front of our friends and family. 5 years, Natalie. We have spent 5 entire years building this beautiful life together. I know I made some terrible financial mistakes, but I only did it because the immense pressure of providing for everyone was completely crushing me. I wanted to give you the world. I wanted to give you this magnificent house. I lost my way under the intense corporate stress, but my heart has always belonged to you. He frantically gestured toward the grand foyer where Stephanie was currently being patted down by a female federal agent. Her emerald designer dress was wrinkled, and her face was a mask of absolute terror. It was all her. Richard cried out loudly, completely throwing his mistress to the federal wolves without a single second of hesitation. Stephanie manipulated my stress. She used her medical connections to pressure me into the illegal real estate investments. She demanded that luxury penthouse and threatened to ruin my career at the firm if I did not fund it for her. I was weak, and I let her seduce me, but she means absolutely nothing to me, Natalie. She is garbage. I will completely cut her off right now. I will testify against her in federal court and help the agents put her away forever. Just please tell them to leave me alone. I will be the devoted husband you always wanted. I swear on my life I will dedicate every single day to making you incredibly happy. Stephanie let out a loud, outraged scream from the hallway, calling him a cowardly liar and a manipulative sociopath. But a tactical officer quickly instructed her to remain completely silent. The sheer absolute lack of loyalty Richard displayed was staggering. He was perfectly willing to bankrupt his widowed mother emotionally, destroy his younger sister, and send his brilliant mistress to federal prison if it meant saving his own pathetic skin. He had absolutely no moral center. He was just a dark void of endless consuming greed. I stood completely motionless, letting his desperate promises wash over me. For 3 long years, I had listened to this man belittle my intelligence, mock my career setback, and publicly humiliate me in front of his wealthy peers. He had treated me like a useless domestic burden while secretly funding an extravagant illicit lifestyle using millions of dollars in stolen money. He thought my quiet compliance was weakness. He thought my patience was pure stupidity. He truly thought he could buy his way out of federal prosecution with cheap tears and hollow apologies. I looked at the federal agents who were watching the scene with quiet professional respect. Then I looked down at the man clutching my ankles. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The love I once had for him had died a very long time ago, entirely replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a federal investigator doing her job. I slowly pulled my right foot back. With a sharp, deliberate, and incredibly satisfying motion, I kicked his bloody hands entirely off my ankles. Richard gasped and fell backward onto the hardwood floor, his eyes wide with shock as the physical rejection finally registered in his panicked brain. He looked up at me, waiting for me to scream, or cry, or show any sign of emotional distress that he could potentially manipulate. but I simply smoothed the front of my dress and offered him a chilling, perfectly polite smile. "I am incredibly sorry, Richard," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. "But a brilliant financial visionary like you simply cannot be chained to a woman whose greatest daily intellectual challenge is picking out matching curtain fabrics. You need an absolute equal. After all, I am just the family maid. And my greatest achievement this year was finally figuring out how to sweep the absolute trash out of my house." The federal agents did not waste another single second. Two heavily armored tactical officers stepped forward, grabbing Richard by the arms and hauling his limp body off the hardwood floor. He offered absolutely no physical resistance. His spirit was completely broken. The special agent in charge gave a brief nod to his team, signaling that it was time to officially process the room and secure the primary suspects. My attention shifted toward the grand entryway, where Dr. Stephanie was currently trying to negotiate her way out of a massive federal indictment. The brilliant plastic surgeon had somehow managed to recover a tiny fraction of her arrogant composure. She stood up straight, smoothing down the wrinkles in her expensive emerald silk dress and glaring at the female tactical agent who was currently searching her designer handbag. "I demand to speak to my legal counsel immediately," Stephanie announced, her voice trembling but dripping with that familiar upper-class entitlement. "I am a highly respected medical professional in this state. I am officially invoking my absolute right to remain silent, and I refuse to answer any of your questions without my lawyer present. You have absolutely no right to detain me in this manner. I was completely manipulated by that man, and I am a victim of his financial abuse." The female federal agent did not even look up from the handbag. She pulled out a stack of encrypted flash drives and placed them methodically into a clear plastic evidence bag. "Invoking your right to remain silent implies that you actually plan on being quiet, the agent replied, her tone completely flat and unimpressed. "And we do not need you to answer any questions tonight. The forensic audit provided by the SEC whistleblower already answered every single question we had." Stephanie swallowed hard, her confident facade cracking once again. "You cannot arrest me," she stammered, taking a step backward until her shoulders hit the foyer wall. "I have critical surgeries scheduled for Monday morning. My patients rely on me. If you put your hands on me, my lawyers will sue this entire federal department for wrongful arrest and public defamation. I did not steal anything." The special agent in charge walked slowly into the foyer, holding the thick federal file I had provided. "You did not steal the money directly, Stephanie?" he agreed, flipping open the heavy folder. "But you knowingly allowed Richard to funnel over $8 million of stolen corporate capital through your private medical clinic. You signed off on fraudulent medical supply invoices to wash the dirty cash. You then used those clean funds to purchase a $4.5 million penthouse in Manhattan. That makes you a primary co-conspirator in a massive federal money laundering operation." Stephanie opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The sheer granular detail of the federal charges completely paralyzed her. She realized in that exact moment that I had not just looked at a few bank statements. I had forensically dismantled her entire medical practice from the ground up. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the female agent commanded, stepping forward and pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. Stephanie began to hyperventilate. "No, please," she begged, her medical prestige completely evaporating into thin air. "Please do not do this to me. I will lose my medical license. I will lose everything I have ever worked for. I will cooperate fully. I will tell you everything Richard did behind closed doors. Just please do not put those on me." The agent did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She grabbed Stephanie by the wrist, spinning her around roughly and securely, locking the cold metal cuffs onto her wrists. The sharp clicking sound of the ratchets tightening echoed loudly across the quiet house. The humiliation was absolute and entirely cinematic. The corporate executives who had just toasted to her modern female excellence now watched in silent horror as she was escorted out the front door. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers illuminated her tear-streaked face as she was marched out into the freezing November night. She stumbled awkwardly in her designer high heels, looking absolutely pathetic, as an officer guided her into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. Her elite high society life was officially and permanently over. With the mistress removed from the premises, the remaining agents began reading Richard his Miranda rights. He stood with his head bowed, completely silent, while the officers secured his hands behind his back. He looked like a hollow, empty shell. But the drama in the dining room was not quite finished. A loud, agonizing wail broke the heavy silence. Brenda, my mother-in-law, pushed herself out of her high-backed chair. Her legs were completely unsteady, and she practically collapsed against the edge of the mahogany table, sending a few remaining silverware pieces clattering to the floor. She looked at her son in handcuffs, and then she looked at me. The arrogant, condescending woman who had spent years inspecting my baseboards and calling me a useless freeloader was entirely gone. She stumbled across the room, her expensive jewelry clinking together as she fell heavily to her knees right in front of me. "Natalie, I am begging you," Brenda sobbed, grabbing the hem of my dress with her trembling hands. "Please, you have to stop them. You cannot let them take my boy away. He is all I have left in this world. He took my retirement money and Derek just left Caroline. We have absolutely nothing left. If you send Richard to federal prison, I will end up living on the street. Please, Natalie, have mercy on us. I have no one else to rely on." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. Brenda had spent the last 36 months making my life an absolute living hell. She was the woman who purposely spilled red wine on my white carpets just to watch me scrub them on my hands and knees. She was the woman who constantly told Richard he deserved a more successful wife. She was the woman who happily ate my food, drank my expensive wine, and sat in my living room while calling me a useless parasite. And now she was begging that exact same parasite to save her entire family from federal ruin. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my dress one final time and pulled out a neatly folded piece of heavy cardstock. I dropped it onto the hardwood floor right next to her trembling hands. "What is this?" Brenda whispered, her voice completely broken as she stared blindly at the paper. "That is an itemized invoice, Brenda." I stated, my voice cold and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "Since you all love to talk about financial contributions and paying your fair share, I decided to calculate exactly what this family owes me for the past 3 years. I billed you for my services as a live-in maid, a private chef, and a property manager. I also added the massive back rent you technically owe me for hosting your lavish holiday parties in my house without my permission. I included a premium charge for cleaning up the absolute garbage you brought into my life. And finally, I included a substantial emotional damages fee for putting up with your constant toxic abuse." Brenda let out a weak, pathetic sob, completely unable to comprehend the cold reality of my words. "You cannot do this to me," she cried, clutching her chest. "I am an old woman. Where am I supposed to go, Natalie? I do not have a single penny left to my name. You can go exactly where you told me to go 3 years ago." "Brenda," I replied, stepping back so she was no longer touching my dress. "When I lost my corporate job, you told Richard to throw me out on the street because I was dead weight. You said family is only for people who actually contribute to the bottom line. Well, your bottom line is currently 0. You endorsed your son's financial abuse because you thought it personally benefited you. You turned a blind eye to his obvious mistress because she bought you expensive gifts and complimented your terrible taste in China. You do not get to play the innocent, helpless victim now that the stolen money has completely dried up." Caroline, who was still sitting on the floor nearby, stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized that the safety net she had always relied on was completely gone. The cruel hierarchy they had established to torture me had entirely collapsed, and they were buried entirely under the heavy rubble. They had treated me like dirt, and now they were the ones begging on the floor. "You have exactly 2 hours to gather whatever personal belongings you brought with you tonight," I announced, my gaze sweeping over the weeping mother and the sobbing sister. After that, my private security team will physically remove you from my property. You are no longer welcome in my house. You are no longer part of my life. And if you ever try to contact me again, I will hand over the audio recordings of your terrible behavior to the local press and completely destroy whatever tiny shred of social standing you have left in this state. Brenda slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold hardwood floor. The absolute finality of my words completely crushed her. She realized that I was not the weak, submissive woman they had bullied. I was the architect of their ultimate destruction, and I had executed my plan with absolute, devastating perfection. The special agent in charge watched the entire exchange with quiet approval. He knew exactly what kind of psychological warfare I had endured to secure the federal evidence for his team. He gave me a final respectful nod, acknowledging my absolute victory, before turning his full attention back to the ruined man standing in the hallway. The two heavily armored tactical officers yanked Richard roughly to his feet. His legs could barely support his own weight. He looked completely dead inside his eyes, staring blankly at the ruined dining room and the shattered remains of his perfect, affluent life. Richard, the special agent in charge, barked, his voice echoing with absolute federal authority, cutting through the pathetic sounds of Brenda weeping. You are formally under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, tax evasion, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly behind Richard's back as the tactical officers forcefully turned him toward the grand entryway. He did not fight them. He did not look back at his weeping mother or his hysterical sister. The man who had spent his entire adult life projecting an aura of absolute invincibility was now nothing more than a shuffling, defeated criminal. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal cruisers outside painted his pale face in harsh, alternating colors as he was marched out the front door. The freezing November wind whipped through the foyer for a brief moment before the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him, sealing his ultimate fate. He was gone, and he was never coming back to this house. Caroline watched her brother disappear into the night, and the final thread holding her fragile reality together snapped completely. She let out a hollow gasping sound and slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold hardwood floor. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. The heavy diamond earrings she wore suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her entirely ruined life. Her husband had abandoned her, taking their children and her financial security with him. Her brother was on his way to a federal holding cell. Her mother was entirely bankrupt. Caroline was completely alone, surrounded by the shattered pieces of the arrogant dynasty she had helped build. The 12 corporate executives and their elegantly dressed wives had been standing perfectly still in the dining room, absolutely terrified of drawing any attention to themselves. They had arrived at this house just a few hours ago, driving luxury vehicles and carrying expensive gifts, expecting a lavish evening of celebration. They had come to toast Richard and his brilliant financial mind. They had happily eaten the gourmet meal I spent 2 days preparing, drank my expensive vintage wine, and laughed at my expense when Richard called me a maid. Now they were desperate to escape the toxic radioactive fallout of this massive federal raid. One by one, they began to move. The senior vice president who had praised Richard earlier in the evening quietly stepped over the broken fine china on the floor. He did not make eye contact with me or the sobbing women on the rug. He walked briskly to the hall closet, grabbed his cashmere overcoat, and practically sprinted out the front door. The others quickly followed his lead. They moved like frightened mice, scurrying toward the exit without uttering a single word of gratitude for the dinner or offering any sympathy for the family. The wealthy women who had sneered at my simple black dress just hours ago now kept their heads down, pulling their expensive fur wraps tightly around their shoulders. They stepped carefully around Caroline, avoiding her as if her sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. There were no polite goodbyes. There were no fake smiles or promises to call and offer emotional support. In the brutal high-stakes world of corporate finance, loyalty only extended as far as the nearest dollar sign, and Richard was completely out of money. Within 5 short minutes, the grand foyer was entirely empty of guests. The heavy front door clicked shut for the last time, leaving only the faint hum of the smart home security system in its wake. The federal agents had also finished their sweep. The special agent in charge gave me one final respectful nod before leading his tactical team out the door carrying the heavy boxes of encrypted evidence that would put Richard and Stephanie behind bars for decades. The chaotic, deafening noise of the federal raid, the shouting commands, the crying, and the panicked scrambling was abruptly replaced by a heavy, absolute silence. The only sound left in the massive $2 million mansion was the pathetic, quiet sobbing of Brenda and Caroline huddled together on the floor. They were entirely broken, stripped of their arrogance and their stolen wealth. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, letting the absolute victory wash over me. I had spent 3 grueling years playing the role of the submissive, obedient maid. I had endured their endless insults, their cruel jokes, and their blatant disrespect. I had meticulously gathered every single piece of evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And tonight I had burned their entire corrupt empire to the absolute ground. I took a deep breath of the quiet, cool air circulating through the house. The heavy, oppressive weight that had been sitting on my chest for 36 months was finally gone. I felt incredibly light. I felt entirely free. I slowly turned away from the 2 miserable women crying on the foyer floor. Leaving them to drown in their own pathetic misery, I turned my attention back to the ruined room, where the entire confrontation began. I walked slowly toward the massive mahogany dining table. The surface was a complete disaster area of spilled red wine, shattered crystal glasses, and half-eaten gourmet food. The extravagant Thanksgiving feast that I had spent 2 entire days meticulously preparing was completely ruined by the sheer panic of the federal raid. The expensive floral centerpieces were knocked over, and the pristine white linen was stained with dark red blotches. But I was not upset at all. I walked directly to the head of the table. The grand high-backed chair that Richard had always claimed as his absolute throne, the seat where he demanded constant respect and admiration, was currently empty. I pulled the heavy chair back and sat down comfortably. I smoothed the skirt of my simple black dress. For the first time in 3 years, I was the absolute master of my own dining room. I looked down at the pristine white porcelain plate sitting untouched in front of me. While everyone else had been stuffing their faces and laughing at my expense earlier tonight, I had not taken a single bite of food. My stomach gave a quiet rumble, reminding me that executing a massive federal takedown requires a significant amount of energy. I picked up my heavy silver fork and knife. I reached across the messy table and carved a thick, perfectly roasted slice of turkey from the massive bird sitting on the silver platter. I placed the meat on my plate, added a generous scoop of homemade cranberry sauce, and took my very first bite of the evening. It was absolutely delicious. The flavors were perfectly balanced, but the absolute best part was the sweet, undeniable taste of total victory. I chewed slowly, savoring the quiet, peaceful atmosphere that had finally replaced the toxic noise of my former family. The silence was incredibly satisfying after years of their constant verbal abuse. Brenda and Caroline were still huddled together on the floor of the grand foyer. They were weeping softly, entirely paralyzed by the sudden violent destruction of their wealthy reality. I swallowed my food and placed my silver fork neatly down on the white tablecloth. The sharp clinking sound echoed through the quiet room, making both women flinch. I looked at them, my expression completely cold and entirely devoid of mercy. "You two have exactly 2 hours," I announced, my voice echoing with absolute authority. 2 hours to pack whatever cheap overnight bags you brought with you and get out of my house. Caroline looked up, her tear-stained face twisting in pure disbelief. "Your house," she choked out, her voice shaking. This is Richard House. He pays the mortgage. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Richard does not own anything, Caroline, I corrected her simply. The federal government just seized every single asset tied to his name. But this specific property is securely held in an independent trust entirely funded by my own private legitimate earnings before we ever got married. I let him pretend he was the king of the castle because it made my federal investigation significantly easier. I let him pay the utility bills to boost his fragile ego. But my name is the only name on the actual deed. You are currently trespassing on my private property, and I want you gone immediately. Brenda let out another agonizing wail, burying her face against her daughter's shoulder. They had absolutely nowhere to go. Their credit cards were likely already frozen by the federal authorities due to their direct association with Richard. They were completely destitute. They had spent years treating me like a worthless servant, and now they were begging on the floor of my grand foyer. The irony was absolutely beautiful. 2 hours I repeated my tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or pity. If you are still inside my house when the clock strikes midnight, my private security team will physically drag you out onto the front lawn. And I promise you the local news crews are already waiting at the end of the driveway to broadcast your absolute humiliation to the entire world. Do not test my patience, Caroline. Get up and start packing right now. Caroline slowly nodded, her spirit completely broken. She helped her weeping mother off the hardwood floor, and they began to slowly shuffle toward the guest bedrooms. As they disappeared down the hallway, I turned my attention back to the dining table. I slowly reached into the hidden pocket of my black dress one last time. I pulled out a single crisp white envelope. It was not a federal document or a bank ledger. It was something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. I placed the envelope flat on the mahogany table right next to my dinner plate. I stared at the crisp white envelope resting on the ruined tablecloth. Inside were the absolute final pieces of my total emancipation. A unilateral petition for divorce already signed and officially filed with the state Supreme Court earlier this morning. Right behind that document was a comprehensive and permanent restraining order. Richard would be served with these exact papers the very moment he was processed into the federal detention center. He would be sitting in a cold, damp concrete cell wearing a bright orange jumpsuit stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his fake prestige when he officially found out that he was no longer my husband. He would learn in the most humiliating way possible that he was legally forbidden from ever contacting me again for the rest of his miserable life. The restraining order also explicitly extended to Brenda and Caroline. I had instructed my legal team to include ironclad clauses that prevented his toxic mother and his delusional sister from ever stepping foot anywhere near my property. They were legally barred from attempting to communicate with me through phone calls, emails, or any third-party channels. If they even tried to reach out to beg for money, they would be immediately arrested. They were completely excised from my life like a malignant tumor. The long, agonizing 3-year performance was finally over. I did not have to wash another dish, smile at another insulting joke, or pretend to be intellectually inferior to people who were fundamentally broken and corrupt. I picked up my heavy silver fork and took another bite of the roasted turkey, letting the absolute peaceful silence of the empty dining room wash over me. Tomorrow morning, the massive federal wire transfer would officially hit my heavily encrypted private bank accounts. $10 million in pristine, legal whistleblower bounty money. It was the ultimate poetic justice. Richard had spent years risking federal prison to steal millions of dollars just to fund a fake empire and impress shallow corporate executives who did not actually care about him. I had simply done my job with absolute precision, and the federal government was rewarding me with a massive fortune that was completely clean and entirely mine. I already knew exactly what I was going to do with my newfound absolute freedom and my massive wealth. First, I was going to hire a premium professional cleaning crew to scrub every single inch of this $2 million mansion. I wanted them to completely erase the physical and emotional stains of my former in-laws. I wanted the smell of Brenda cheap perfume and Richard expensive cologne entirely banished from my sanctuary. Then I was going to pack a single elegant suitcase and call a private luxury car to take me directly to the international airport. I had already booked a first-class ticket to the Amalfi Coast. I planned to spend the next 6 entire months sitting on a sun-drenched private balcony overlooking the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. I would drink actual expensive vintage wine that I bought with my own money, and I would read about Richard's massive public federal trial in the international financial papers. I would watch his complete destruction from the absolute comfort of a five-star Italian villa. I would not have to answer to anyone. I would not have to hide my intelligence or mask my true capabilities ever again. I could finally breathe the clean air of absolute victory. The millions of dollars I was about to receive were not just a government reward for catching a corporate criminal. They were my absolute compensation for the 3 years of psychological warfare I had silently endured. Every single snide comment Brenda ever made about my cooking, every single time Caroline aggressively flaunted her stolen designer bags in my face, and every single lie Richard whispered to me before leaving to sleep with his mistress had all been meticulously calculated and heavily invoiced, and the United States government was paying that invoice in full. I finished my meal and placed my silver utensils neatly on the white porcelain plate. I stood up from the head of the mahogany table, my posture completely straight and my head held high. I looked around the destroyed dining room one last time. The shattered crystal wine glasses, the spilled red wine soaking into the rug, and the abandoned luxury coats were all beautiful testaments to the absolute destruction of arrogant people. They had looked at me and seen a weak, submissive woman they could easily control and endlessly exploit. They thought my quiet compliance was a sign of stupidity. They thought my endless patience was a complete lack of ambition. But they forgot the most fundamental rule of survival in this world. The quietest person in the room is always the one listening the closest and calculating the hardest. They treated me like a worthless disposable maid, but I was actually the architect holding the match that burned their entire fake world to the ground. The game was officially over. The board was entirely cleared, and I was the only one left standing. I walked away from the ruined mahogany table and moved slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the front of the living room. The cold November night pressed against the thick glass, but inside my house, the air was perfectly warm and entirely still. I stood in the darkness and watched the street. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vehicles painted the neighborhood trees in harsh, frantic colors. I watched as the heavy, armored cars slowly rolled down the long, manicured driveway and turned onto the main avenue. I stood there, unblinking, until the very last trace of the police sirens faded into the absolute silence of the distant highway. The physical removal of the toxic infection was finally complete. Richard was gone. The charismatic investment director, the arrogant husband, the man who believed he was entirely untouchable, was currently sitting in the back of a freezing federal cruiser with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He was heading toward a concrete holding cell where his expensive custom suits and his fake corporate prestige would mean absolutely nothing. He had spent years building a towering empire of lies, and I had spent 36 months quietly, methodically pulling out the structural pillars one by one until the entire thing collapsed directly onto his head. I turned my back to the window and looked out over the grand foyer. Down the hallway, I could hear the frantic, pathetic sounds of Brenda and Caroline scrambling to pack their belongings. I could hear cheap suitcases zipping and hushed, terrified weeping as they rushed to meet my midnight eviction deadline. They were absolutely paralyzed by the fear of my private security team dragging them out onto the front lawn. They were finally learning the heavy price of their own toxic complicity. They had enabled a monster because he bought them expensive things, and now they were left entirely destitute with no safety net and absolutely no future. I walked past the foyer and stepped into the pristine kitchen. I ignored the dirty dishes and the ruined Thanksgiving preparation entirely. Instead, I walked directly to the custom climate-controlled wine cellar that Richard had installed last year. He had stocked it with incredibly rare, expensive vintages, claiming that a man of his immense wealth needed an impressive collection to entertain his high society guests. I bypassed the standard bottles and reached for the absolute top shelf. I selected a pristine bottle of imported French Burgundy that cost more than most people earned in a single month. It was a bottle Richard had explicitly forbidden me from opening, claiming I did not have the refined palate to truly appreciate it. I pulled the corkscrew from the marble kitchen island and drove the metal spiral deep into the cork. With one smooth, effortless motion, I popped the bottle open. The rich, heavy scent of dark grapes and aged oak immediately filled the air. I reached into the glass cabinet and pulled out a flawless crystal wine glass. I did not rush. I took my time pouring the dark ruby liquid, watching it swirl and settle perfectly into the bowl of the glass. I picked up the crystal glass and walked slowly back into the ruined dining room. The shattered plates, the spilled cranberry sauce, and the abandoned luxury coats were still scattered everywhere like the aftermath of a massive battlefield. But there were no casualties on my side. The entire operation was a flawless masterpiece of legal execution. There was no messy physical violence. There was no illegal hacking or desperate extortion. I had simply used the massive weight of the United States federal justice system to crush my enemies entirely. I played perfectly by the rules, and the rules rewarded me with $10 million, an absolute unadulterated freedom. I stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the beautiful wreckage of their arrogant lives. I raised the heavy crystal wine glass, lifting it high into the quiet air of the empty room. The warm glow of the overhead chandelier caught the deep red liquid, making it shine like a precious gemstone. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife. I was no longer the target of their endless, cruel jokes. I was a multi-million-dollar federal whistleblower who had just executed the most perfect, legally airtight revenge in corporate history. "Here is to the maids," I said, my voice steady, confident, and ringing with absolute ultimate victory. "Here is to the quiet women who finally decide to sweep the absolute trash out of their own lives." I brought the crystal glass to my lips and took a long, deep sip of the incredibly expensive wine. It tasted like absolute perfection. The heavy, oppressive nightmare of the past 3 years was permanently over. The house was finally quiet. The board was entirely cleared, and my beautiful, free, incredibly wealthy life was just beginning. The most powerful lesson to take away from this story is that you should never mistake silence for ignorance or patience for weakness. For 3 long years, Richard and his toxic family mistook Natalie's quiet compliance for submission. They built an entire empire of arrogance, assuming that because she did not shout or brag, she was entirely powerless. They treated her like a disposable maid while they paraded around on stolen wealth. However, true power does not need to announce itself loudly at a dinner party. It operates in the shadows, gathering facts, observing behaviors, and meticulously planning for the perfect moment to strike. Arrogance creates massive blind spots. Richard's greed and his desperate need for constant validation made him incredibly sloppy. He believed his own lies so deeply that he never stopped to consider that the person pouring his wine was also the architect of his absolute destruction. This story teaches us that integrity and quiet competence will always outlast loud, fraudulent behavior. When you are mistreated or undervalued, you do not need to throw a chaotic tantrum or resort to illegal revenge. The most devastating payback is simply letting toxic people dig their own graves while you quietly hold the shovel and document their mistakes. Let them think they are winning right up until the exact moment you legally and permanently dismantle their entire world. If this story of absolute ultimate payback resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice being served. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to quietly cut a toxic person out of your life? Let us know your experience and join the conversation today.